So, our series today is how Andy Cunningham has been at the forefront of tech and innovation since day one, and how she's been helping companies create new product categories ever since. She's also the founder and president of Cunningham Collective. And if you're calling in today from a Mac computer, you can thank Andy for launching the Apple Macintosh with Steve Jobs. She's also helped companies like Next and Pixar, among others, and serves on several boards for nonprofit organizations in the area and around the United States. So Andy, first, thank you so much for coming here and being with us today. It's a real treat and pleasure to have you with us, and we're so glad that the students get a chance to hear from you.
Great. It's great to be here. I love speaking to the students at CMU, and I love Cheryl's classes. So great to be here.
Well, we're genuinely grateful. This has become a real popular series for students and an opportunity for us to hear from people, as I said, leaders in tech in the industry. So if we all were to kind of tell the story of technology and innovation over the last couple of decades, we of course think of the Silicon Valley, which many of us are calling in from. And we think about innovations that have come out like computers and printers and smartphones and ride sharing. But what was it like in the early days when these new innovations were starting to pop up? So when Andy was fresh out of college in the early 80s, she was starting to think about how she could take her writing career or her writing interests and her interest in art to the next level and start a career. So this was kind of before she became this household name that she is now in Silicon Valley. And she was actually a trumpet player at Northwestern University. So I think what we're going to do now is just start with that, Andy, is take us back to the early days of you as a recent college graduate. What was that? Where were you in your life at that time? And what were you thinking about when you were a young Andy?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, I started off at Northwestern University as a music major, and I was a classical performance trumpet major. And as you can imagine, there were about 9 jobs in the United States that might be available to me if I'm going to play in a major symphony in first, second, or third chair. So I quickly discovered that I was good, but not great. And most of those guys, and they were all men in those seats in the orchestras, were in their 40s, and they were not going to be leaving their jobs anytime soon. So I decided it was time to change my major, and I looked at what else I could do besides play the trumpet, and there was only one thing I could do, and that was write. So I basically made a choice to go to the creative writing, to try to get into the creative writing program at Northwestern in their School of College of Arts and Sciences, and I was able to get in, and that's when I discovered that I'm really quite passionate about writing. So I graduated from college with a writing job, but it was one of those sort of, yucko jobs that you get right out of college. Now, they're not all yucko. There's a lot of great ones, but back in the day, if you were a writer and you wanted to write for a magazine or a newspaper, it was not that easy to get that kind of job. But I did get a job writing for a magazine. The name of the magazine was Fleet Maintenance and Specifying. So I got to write about lubrication and engines and exhaust systems and refrigeration and trailers and all the rest of that really fun stuff. So, but they didn't pay me very well. It was a very poorly paid job. And I had to have another job while I was doing that job. So I did 2 things. One thing, I was the receptionist at the J.C. Penney store in downtown Chicago while I was doing this. And then when I decided I didn't really want to do that anymore, so I got a job as, get this, a roller skating hostess at a restaurant. So I did that at the same time I was doing this other job. But it became apparent that I really wanted to have one job that could pay me enough to live on. And so I decided to move on, and I was introduced to a recruiter who looked at me and looked at my experience and my writing and said, I think you'd be great in public relations. And I, of course, wanted to go, because public relations, as a writer for a magazine, I was being bombarded every day by product PR people trying to get me to write about their stuff. So I really didn't like that idea, but I thought, what the heck, I'll go talk to some folks. Turns out I walked into the building at 1 East Wacker Drive in downtown Chicago, where Burson Marsteller was located. And I fell in love. I fell in love with the whole business feeling of it, the whole gestalt of what it was like to be in a big business in downtown Chicago when I was, 22 or however old I was, 23. And I was offered a job there to be in what they called their technology group. Now, mind you, this is 1981. So it was very, very early. It was the year that the IBM PC was introduced. But really, for the most part, there weren't a lot of computers. There was the Apple II, there was the IBM PC, And then there were bigger companies, mini computer companies like DEC that were out there. But I wound up, because of my experience writing about trucks, I wound up in this technology group. And I had a client that, I know Cheryl will remember this company, but no one else on this call will, Bell and Howell. Remember Bell and Howell? Bell and Howell was the company that made educational technology equipment, which back in the day really meant projectors, right? Overhead projectors and actual projectors. But this company, Bell and Howell, struck the only deal ever struck with Apple Computer to remarket the Apple II computer. So believe it or not, Bell and Howell was actually offering the Apple II computer to educational institutions, K through 12, way back in the day. And what they did is they took off the beige cover that was on top of the Apple II and they replaced it with a black cover. And they referred to it in the industry as the Black Apple. Well, this was my client, and they gave me one of these Apple II computers in 1981. And I brought it home, and I didn't bring it home. I brought it to my office, and the librarian, who was super excited about this, and I sat in her office in the library like probably 3 or 4 hours every day, just exploring what you could do with an Apple II computer. And I remember this was a very long time ago. I didn't even think we had real spreadsheets then. I mean, there was very little software, but we were enthralled with it. And my boss started to notice that I was super excited about this computer. So he would every morning, and again, no internet, no cell phones, nothing like that. He would put on my desk every morning an article from the paper that he read about Silicon Valley. So it was either a Time magazine cover with Steve Jobs on it, or it was a Wall Street Journal story. He just kept putting these things on my desk, knowing that I would be interested in it, as we didn't have our own personal news feeds back then. Fast forward a few months as I'm reading all these articles and getting myself all excited about Silicon Valley. One of my friends from the office in Chicago moved to California because Burson Marsteller was opening up an office in Santa Clara, California. And as soon as he got there, he started sending me notes in the inter-office mail, which took 3 days to go back and forth via snail mail. And he said, Andy, you've got to come out here. You will not believe how amazing Silicon Valley is. So I wrangled myself an opportunity to get an interview with that office. So I got on an airplane. I got an interview with the office in Santa Clara, and I met the person who was running the office. And I was so disappointed because he was probably the most chauvinistic male human being I've ever met in my entire life, which surprised the heck out of me being in California. And I knew I could not work for this guy. He was kind of a jerk, and he was definitely not someone that I felt I could put my career into. So I decided to take what leftover time I had that day and see if I could get myself in a meeting with any of the other public relations agencies in Silicon Valley. And I did. I got 3 or 4 different meetings. And the last meeting of the day was with an agency called Regis McKenna. You may not have ever heard of Regis McKenna, but at the time, Regis McKenna was the cat's meow, as we used to say, of public relations agencies in Silicon Valley. He served all of the big, incredible companies: Intel, Microsoft, Apple. All of the big ones were with Regis McKenna. And as it turns out, I showed up on a day where he was desperately looking for somebody to lead the next product launch from Apple, which was the Macintosh, because the team that had been there at Regis McKenna had just launched the Lisa computer, again, another computer you may or may not remember. Probably don't remember, but you might have read about it. And it was such a giant failure in the marketplace that, believe it or not, all the inventory that Apple had of this Lisa computer is buried in Nevada somewhere. It's actually literally in a hole in Nevada, taking up space underground because it was such a failure. So the whole team at Regis McKenna Inc., except for one young woman who was a year younger than me, left. They quit. And so there was Regis with this one young woman, 23 years old, faced with the Macintosh launch in about 8 months, and he had nobody to do it. So there I was, coming in with 2 years of writing experience and 2 years of experience at Burson Marsteller. And we talked for a while, and he offers me the job at the end of the talk. He says, Andy, I need somebody to lead the launch of the Macintosh. Would you consider moving out to California and doing it? I'm like, oh my God, yes, of course I will do that. So I did. So I ended up convincing my fiance at the time to move out here with me, which was hard, actually. He didn't really want to come out to California. We ended up in a big car accident on the way out, but we finally got out to California, and I began this incredible journey of working really closely with Steve Jobs. So the way that it worked on the Apple account at this agency is I handled Steve because I I think Regis saw in me something about my personality that would get along well with Steve. And the other woman, the younger woman, ended up working with the guy who was running Apple at the time, with John Scully, if you know the history there. So that's really what I did. I helped Steve with the messaging and the positioning and all of the things associated with launching that Macintosh. We ended up with, I think, probably the most visible product launch in history, I think, was the Macintosh, even though the product itself didn't sell for years after that. I mean, but we were very much involved in the 1984 ad, which the ad agency made. I don't want to take credit for that, but it only aired once during the Super Bowl, and we were able to get it on television hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times. So and we had 100 journalists covered this in great detail. Got the cover of the Rolling Stone, cover of Fortune, cover of Time. It was a pretty amazing product launch, and so that was a wonderful experience. But shortly thereafter, if you know your history, Steve got fired from Apple. And he got fired from Apple because the Macintosh wasn't selling. And he insisted on keeping it as a product. They wanted to kill it. And he insisted on keeping it. And ultimately they ended up firing him because he was belligerent and not easy to get along with, and had a strategy that the board did not agree with. So they fired Steve. And at that point, I thought, this is a great time for me to leave Regis McKenna and start my own agency. So I talked to Regis. He was wonderful about it. He said, you can use my office at night if you need phones or photocopiers or whatever you need. And I ended up leaving. Literally 2 weeks later, I get a phone call about 10 o'clock in the morning from Steve Jobs. I didn't think I would ever see him again or hear from him again, but he calls me up and he says, I'm going to have a press conference in my backyard today. Do you think that you could come and help me? And I said, okay, sure. When are you doing it? He goes, in like 30 minutes. I said, okay, well, I better get in the car and go over there. So I got in my car and I drove over to his house in Woodside, California, where Cheryl now lives. And true to the legend, there was not a stick of furniture in the place. He was sitting on the floor in the kitchen, but outside the door of his house were about 50 business press people just milling around the yard. You know, Fortune, Forbes, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, all of these publications. There were reporters that I had known from my time at Apple milling around the front yard, waiting for the press conference to begin. I go in and I'm now standing, and Steve is sitting on the floor with 7 other people, 8 actually, 7 other people that I knew who had worked at Apple, and then one other person who turned out to be Steve's lawyer. And Steve looks up at me and he says, okay, I'm going to do this press conference. And I said, what are you going to announce, Steve? He said, I'm going to announce my new company. I'm calling it Next. And I'm also going to tell the world that John Scully is full of, you know what, and the wrongs that he did me while I was at Apple. And I'm beside myself. You're going to what? Do you even have a product? You know, no, I don't have any of those things. It's only been 10 days, right? He doesn't have anything. And I keep looking over at the lawyer thinking, surely you're going to tell him this is a stupid idea, right? He pays you to tell him stuff like that. Well, the lawyer said nothing. So I just thought, you know, what do I have to lose? I'm going to say, Steve, that's a bad idea. You should not have this press conference. You haven't really fully extracted yourself from Apple. You're stealing these 7 people here who are not full. They haven't even resigned from Apple yet. You don't have a product. You are absolutely not going to tell the world what you think about John Scully. That would be a hugely bad thing to do. And he leans back, he folds his arm, he looks up at me and he goes, okay, I won't do it, but you have to get rid of everybody. So I had to go outside and basically this is where I learned one of the big lessons in my life, which is the truth will set you free, right? So what did I say to everybody? The truth. I said, the guy just got fired from Apple 10 days ago. He doesn't have a product yet. You know, he's going to be working with people that haven't yet left their current jobs. So as soon as there's something to announce, I promise you, each and every one of you will be called and we will tell you what we're doing. And they mumbled and they grumbled, but they actually did leave. And I got written up in the San Francisco Chronicle the next day from a very famous columnist that Cheryl will remember, Herb Caen, as the stupid flack that made us all leave Steve Jobs' backyard. So that's my claim to fame in the early days was that. But the best thing about that experience is I think I showed myself to Steve's a value that he thought that he could extract more from as time went on. And so he then hired me to do the work for launching Next and also for launching Pixar, because I didn't know he was going to launch Pixar, neither did he, but I had the opportunity to launch Pixar as well and work with Alvy Ray Smith, who was a friend of Cheryl's. So I was able to start my agency with Steve Jobs as a client. And once you have someone like Steve Jobs as a client, they just keep coming. It was like a, I don't know, machine, and so I was able to build a very big firm. I worked with Steve on and off for about 3 or 4 years after that. And he fired me like 5 times. You may have heard that story about it. And it's true. Whenever he felt like you weren't up to his snuff, he would fire you. And then, a month or two would go by and they'd call you back and say, oh, gee, I really need to have you do this, that, or the other thing. So I have lots of stories about getting fired. But in the end, I ended up working with him for about 3 or 4 more years. And the last time that he fired me, I had a big firm at that point. I had over 200 people working for me and a big payroll to make. So I took on a competitor of Steve's, which was a company at the time called Taligent. Cheryl might remember them. They were a joint effort between IBM and Apple, which at that point Steve hated Apple and he hated IBM. So there was no way that he was going to tolerate me working with anybody like that. And he essentially hung up on me when he called me back to hire me again. And I told him I was working with Taligent, and he was beside himself. And I didn't talk to him for like 15 years after that. I finally did end up talking to him when he got sick. He reached out to some of the people he'd worked with early on, and we were able to reconnect, which was a great thing. But anyway, I built this big agency into a relatively large PR firm. I ended up selling it in 2000 to a London-based firm because they had international offices, and I really needed some international representation. So I did that. But then the crash of 2000 occurred, and none of you probably remember that either. But Silicon Valley was annihilated with the dot-com bomb. It basically destroyed most of the value in Silicon Valley, most of the companies. We called Silicon Valley the place of see-through buildings because there was no one in them. It's hard to imagine this today, but this is what happened. And that was a very devastating blow to the tech industry. And it blew up my firm. My firm went from 250 people at that point down to 50, down to 30, down to 20, down to 10. I just spent 3 years laying people off. And so I ended up, that was very, very devastating for me personally, because I had built up this big firm over the course of my life. I'd had 2 children during that time. I didn't spend 1 minute with either one of them because it was really hard to do both of those things together. And Lauren and I had a discussion about that in our last call. But essentially, all the value that I had built up and the amount that I'd sold the business for all went down to zero when this crash happened. And the crash happened about 2 months after I'd sold the business. So it was kind of a downer time for me. After I lived out my contract, though, I bought back the strategy division of my company, which only had like 3 people in it at that point. The strategy group did. And I brought them over and I created this other firm called CXO Communication, which was really all about brand strategy. I was in a giant non-compete with the PR agency that bought me, so I couldn't do PR anymore. But I kind of just did the same thing, but I did it with brand strategy. I had that for about 8 years. I sold it to my partner, and then I started the company that I have today, which really focuses on positioning. And that's Cheryl held up my book. Thank you, Cheryl. Called Get to Aha, which is really a book about how you actually position companies for success in the tech arena. And I've developed a sort of very logical and rigorous methodology for making that happen. And that's really what my business focuses on today, is helping companies that are rooted in technology figure out how to define their role and relevance in the marketplace. So I've had the opportunity to work with all kinds of great companies, big companies, little companies, amazing CEOs, other people like Steve Jobs, although I've never worked with Elon Musk, even though I'd love to have the opportunity. I have never even met Elon Musk, but a lot of other people like that, of that ilk, and companies that have done amazing things. So with that, that's my story. So I came here on a long journey from the Chicago suburbs.
Well, it was a great summary of what would, I imagine, have been lots of twists and turns along the way. And I really want to come back to the positioning and what your interests are now. But before we do that, I kind of want to circle all the way back to something that you sort of skimmed over, but I thought was so fascinating, because you're talking about how here you are, Steve Jobs gets fired, and you now you decide before you even know that you have this account, you decide to start something on your own. You decide to start your own firm. And how old were you at that time?
I was 28.
So you're 28 years old. You have a job. You have a position that seems like it was doing well. And then you decide to take this leap and start your own thing. I mean, what gave you the confidence to do that? Like, how did you do that without knowing you had any clients at that time?
Well, the funny thing about being 28 is you don't know that you don't know anything. You just don't know you don't know anything. So I thought I knew a lot. um, and I learned stuff as I went along. But I had an uncle that had his own business, and I had always admired him for that. And it was in California, in Southern California, and I just like almost in a dream world envisioned what it must be like to have your own business. And it was constantly playing on me with him and his business. And it wasn't even a big business. He basically ground lenses for eyeglasses, but he did it in his own lab, with his own customers. So I was always attracted to the idea. And the other reason is that, so you might think that having a great relationship with Steve Jobs is a really positive thing. Well, it wasn't then. I was aligned with Steve, and Steve was the enemy. Steve was the enemy at Apple. So no one wanted, I wasn't going to be able to continue working with Apple. So I'd have to get other accounts at the agency. I mean, they weren't going to fire me or anything because I'd done a good job of building up that business for them. But it wasn't a pleasant time to be a Steve Jobs ally. So I thought, what the heck? I didn't have kids at that point. I was married. My fiance came out. We got married, and all that worked out well. And I thought, if I'm going to take a risk, I might as well do it when I'm young. I don't have children, and if it fails, what the heck? I'll start over again. So that's really what was behind starting it. So.
And you have you've seen the early Silicon Valley, the dot-com boom, the recession of 2008, 2009. You now you have this new book, you've seen it all in a lot of ways. And it was really interesting actually to hear you talk about the early days of Silicon Valley when people were saying, you should come out to this place called Silicon Valley. Whereas now when we talk about Silicon Valley, we're all sort of like describing this place that we all seem to know. And yet, like we were talking about on the call the other day, like there's nothing here. Like Silicon Valley is not like a physical location. It's just this idea or this kind of concept.
Yeah.
So can you just tell us about like, what was it like being then to now, and how have you just seen the Silicon Valley transform with technology and innovation?
Oh my, Silicon Valley. So, it is a state of mind. I think it was then and it is now, but it actually is a real place. It's the place where they cut down all the prune orchards down in the valley there, and they replaced it with semiconductor manufacturing plants. That's really kind of the beginnings of and that's why they call it Silicon Valley, because the semiconductor companies were making chips down there. And the buildings, the architecture was horrible. There was nothing beautiful about Silicon Valley. I think once they cut the orchards down, it was nothing but dry and these low 1-story tall buildings that people were basically in there laboring over their semiconductor clean rooms. So Silicon Valley was an actual place, and it was fed, of course, by all the universities that are here. Stanford and Berkeley and all of the rest of them were feeding talent into these places. And it was also a place where, this is largely because of California, but it was largely a place where you could be anything or anyone and do anything. Now, I came from a place in Chicago where if you weren't part of the old boy network, you weren't going anywhere, right? You needed to be admitted into the old boy network, and there were no women in the old boy network. I'll tell you that right now. But out here in California, people were much more open about how old you were, what your gender was, what your sexual preference was. There are all these things that no one cared about here, like they cared about it in Chicago. What you wore, I mean, it was unbelievable. When I was in Chicago working for Burson Marsteller, I had to wear pantsuits with little ties every day. Remember that, Cheryl? Yes. I mean, we had to wear certain clothes every day. And then I come out here and people are in t-shirts and jeans, and, it was just a completely different place. So anyway, it became a place. But one of the things that I want to say about the change in Silicon Valley over the years, and I describe this as it's the journey. And again, I hate to keep giving Cheryl all these things that no one else has ever heard of, but Silicon Valley went from hanging out at Ricky's Hyatt Hotel on El Camino in Palo Alto to the Rosewood Hotel up on 280. Now, if you know anything about a Rosewood Hotel, you know that it's one of the most expensive resorts there is out there. And Ricky's Hyatt was this rickety old, falling down hotel, motel, right,
Yeah.
with a ballroom that looked like it came from the 1930s.
Right.
And that's where the industry gathered forever, in this Ricky's Hyatt ballroom. If there was going to be a product launch or event, it happened at Ricky's Hyatt. And over the course of the
What was the restaurant that was right there? Was
Oh,
it?
Trader Joe's was
Yeah,
also there. Yeah, or
right.
not Trader Joe's, that's the store. Trader Vic's. Trader
Mix.
Vic's.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, what happened though over time, and this is really the dot-com bomb that annihilated much of Silicon Valley. It actually made famous a handful of companies that we all know about today, and the wealth that was associated with those companies moved Silicon Valley from Ricky's Hyatt to the Rosewood Hotel, because we no longer had to spend $39.90 a night for a hotel room and rent a ballroom for $200. Now we could afford $2,000 a night for a hotel room and $10,000 to rent a ballroom. And the whole industry changed with that. It became about the money, the kind of car you drive, the affairs you would have, the venture capital money you raised. It changed so dramatically over the course of those 15 years. And I actually want to do a little historical book called Silicon Valley from Ricky's Hyatt to the Rosewood Hotel, because that journey of 15 years changed the face of this industry forever. Mm-hmm. So that was the sad part. But the happy part is that technology is in everything now. It's in our food, it's in our automobiles, it's in our musical instruments, it's in our heating and air conditioning systems. I mean, there is no tech industry anymore because it's part of everything. So I feel very proud to have been a part of an industry that changed the world so dramatically, mostly good ways. There's definitely some bad ways, but mostly good ways. And that's what technology does. It's basically just a thing, and it's humans who decide to use it for good or bad.
Right. Well, you heard it here first. We're going to read that book when it comes out.
Can I tell you just a little, this is kind of just a little funny thing that happened to me back then. So again, this was when I was doing this, when I first started my company. I started my company in 1985, and I was relatively very successful early on. And so in 1989, I decided to buy a brand new Corvette. I didn't have kids yet at this point. And I had to buy an American-made car because one of my big clients was Motorola, and Motorola insisted that all of its vendors and all of its senior executives drive American cars because they were an American company. So I felt like they were paying me millions of dollars a year. So I felt that I should comply with their desires to have. So I bought an American car, and I bought a Corvette. So I'm driving this Corvette, and I went to a racquetball club. We all used to play racquetball back then. That was the big sport. And there was a place down in Santa Clara called the Decathlon Club, and that's where everybody hung out. And I was driving over there to do my workout one night after work in my Corvette, top down. I pull into the lot, and the lot at the club is full. So I pull into the little Silicon Valley Semiconductor Company lot next to the club. And I park my car, I turn it off, and I get out. And it's at the moment that I'm getting out of the car, there's an older gentleman, probably my age today. He's coming out of the back door of this little, what we used to call a Silicon Valley tilt-up company. And he's walking out, and he looks at me, and he looks at my car. He looks at me, he looks at my car. He cannot compute. How is it that there is a young woman driving a Corvette? I cannot get it. So he can't help himself, and he says, "Is that your car?" And I say, "Yes." And he goes, "Oh my God, you must type really fast."
Oh my!
Can you believe that? And so my response was, "Actually, I do."
That's great.
So it was just very funny. So the whole mindset about men and women and all of that was so different back then. It was just a very different thing. So anyway, go ahead, Lauren.
Like, despite the fact that there were more open to women than maybe in Chicago, that there was still this, of course, gender bias.
Yes, but it wasn't nasty. He wasn't nasty about it. He was just in shock. Like,
one of the things was that we were growing so fast in that 15-year period, having done the crash, and then anybody that could code, they didn't care what you were, what you did, you were hired.
That's right. As we used to say, if you could fog a mirror, you'd be hired.
Yeah.
And then through all of that, Andy, it's like you started going deeper into your interests too, until now you're focusing on positioning and your passion around that. I mean, tell us about, and then I want to transition to student questions, by the way. So if you have not started submitting questions, please do now. But I do want to hear this story of just your own interest, right? You started is in writing about trucks, and then now you're really focused on this whole interest you have around positioning and how to help companies do that. So talk to us about how did just your own self and your own interest evolve over time to where you are now with your
Sure.
passions?
So what happened to me is in the early years of Silicon Valley, again, back to the early years, these companies were run by very young engineers who didn't know anything, who really didn't know anything about business, right? They knew a lot about technology, but they didn't know anything about business. So at that point, my job was to do PR for them, right? Which meant to go out and get press coverage for them. So I would take them, to go see the New York Times or Business Week or one of these publications, and have them launch into their story, and they could talk about the product fine, but then the business journalist would say, "So tell me, what is your strategy?" And they were like dumbfounded. They couldn't even respond because they had no idea what that meant. And this happened over and over and over again with some pretty big companies, actually, that were big at the time. And so I just started helping them figure out how to articulate a strategy, how to develop a strategy, how to articulate a strategy, and how to fit it into the market. And that was kind of the beginnings of me understanding and learning about what positioning is. And I realized, oh my God, the power that I have with these people is pretty amazing, right? I'm not just a publicist. I'm like helping them figure out how to take their products and actually bring them to market successfully and position them successfully. So over the years, I just kind of honed a methodology for doing it that ultimately turned into a book. So I had to give things labels, and I had to make things step by step. But it was out of necessity because my clients were sounding like idiots to the New York Times.
That's fabulous. I think it brings us to a good point to pass it over to Cheryl to now hear from some students. We've heard a great overview, and now let's dig into some of the things that students want to know about Andy. So Cheryl, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Okay, great. This is fun. It brings back so many memories, Andy. It's kind of interesting because I remember when Steve Jobs I worked for the Bank of America before I was at HP, and Steve was trying to sell the Bank of America, Lisa. And
yes.
Tom Clausen was sitting next to me. I was the head of international systems at the time. And Tom Clausen sitting next to me. In walks Steve and two of his henchmen and this thing that he was calling Lisa.
Which was like a doorstop.
It was. And he's got on Levi's and a black sweater, t-shirt thing. And his two henchmen are in suits. And Clausen leans over to me and he goes, "Who's the jerk in the Levi's?" And I said, that would be Steve Jobs.
I mean, that's how people thought about that kind of,
Totally. It was San Francisco versus Silicon Valley. And same as you at the bank, it was an all men's world at the time. And same thing, little ties, white shirt. And I'll tell you the story when we're having a glass of wine. But let me pull up a couple of quick questions.
Okay, great.
Did Steve Jobs have more or better answers for the press than others at the same time?
Well, yes, he did, but it wasn't so much because of strategy early on. It was more because he had this capacity to just entrance a person. He would take his black steely eyes and he'd stare at you, and you'd just be drawn in, and he could tell you anything. He could tell you, we're going to get in a spaceship now and we're going to go to Jupiter, and you'd be like, "Yep, I'm with you."
Yeah.
So it was more or less
the distortion zone at the time.
Yes, we called it the reality distortion field. As soon as you came into his presence, you were influenced by this reality distortion field, and anything seemed believable, incredible. So he would say all kinds of things, and I don't think I necessarily, once you were like in the inner circle, you knew what was the reality distortion field and what wasn't. But if you were slightly outside that circle, like this lawyer I told you about that day, you just were entranced. I saw so many journalists, their eyes would glaze over and their mouths would drop open. He could say anything and they would write anything. It was incredible, absolutely incredible. But as he got more experienced and older, like I remember he gave a pitch to the press about Next, which by the way was this, Next was his what do you call it when you lose a boyfriend and you bounce back? What's the word for that? Anyway. Rebound,
Rebound?
right. Next was a rebound company, right? It wasn't even really a thing. It was something that he invented because he was in this rebound mode. So he started to realize he needed some strategy behind it. He needed some of these other things. So he developed this presentation that he called the 4 waves of computing, which was the first time that I had ever seen Steve actually think about strategy in that way. He often thought he was very good at figuring out what people were going to want to do later on in their lives. He could predict what consumers would want, but coming up with a strategy like that was really not his thing. And he did this presentation, and it was really good. It was about how we started with the mainframe computers, and then we went to the minis, and then we went to the personals, and then we went to the workstations, and next was this workstation thing. So anyway, I think he did a very good job with that. But he was growing up.
Yeah, Gladys says that she heard him say, "Don't be afraid, you can do it." That seemed to be a line he used all the time.
Yes, fear was something he did not
He
experience.
did not. He did not have, and he didn't care what he said to you relative to the impact on you. When we were at that meeting with Clausen, and he kept looking, well, I was the one saying, "No, we aren't going to buy the Lisa." And finally he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because we can't let data go out on a device that we can't control. This is company's business, is money information that our customers are trusting us with." And
Right.
well, that's just stupid. You guys are going to be left behind. And he got
That's
up
just
and
stupid.
walked
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. No, he said that's just stupid so many times. Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'll
But I
never
mean,
forget that.
you fast forward today, and now it's bring your own device, right? Not only
Right.
are we letting people have,
Everybody's doing their banking on their phone.
exactly. Yeah. The world has changed. This is one of the many things that technology has brought to the table. Yes.
Speaking of technology, one of the questions that came in is that the Silicon Valley in recent decades has been focusing more and more on software and seeming to let that hardware disappear out of the valley. But now hardware is becoming more and more important as we're integrating things more between software, hardware, and the design, and then how you position that. Like 5G and things like that are starting to come into play, and quantum physics and things like that with quantum computing. How do you see missing hardware part now? How do you see Silicon Valley coming back and trying to recover into that role of being a player as opposed to just a buyer?
So I think that you're absolutely very prescient, whoever asked that question about hardware coming back into the play. And I think that the reason that's happening is because of artificial intelligence. So now we're able to imbue all of our software with artificial intelligence that can inform a piece of hardware to do something, whether it's a car or an airplane or a robot. We now have the glue that can connect the hardware to the software, which is really, I think, artificial intelligence. And again, Cheryl will know this, like over the course of my career since the early 80s, artificial intelligence has had its moments, and then it would die off, and then it's had its moment, and then it would die off. I think we're in a longer moment right now with AI. I think we've finally come to a point where AI is actually doing something useful. But for so long, it was a promise and not a real thing. So I think we're going to get back in the hardware business.
Okay, so here's one that I like because it's totally on the other side of the technology side. How do you overcome culture habits or their own culture resistance to new ideas or putting things in the market? Because you have to deal with so many companies, and the culture hits you smack in the face sometimes for resisting. I know how this product ought to be in the market. How do you deal with it?
There's a thing that is a really important element to technology that most people forget about, and that's context. It's the timing at which you do something, right? Some great ideas never got to happen because it wasn't the right time.
Right.
For example, I recently launched a medical technology company that basically is making a pocket PCR. We call it a personal PCR device. It's this big. If you know anything about the COVID-19 tests that you get, the most reliable ones are called PCR tests. They are done in a lab in a room about the size of the one I'm in, and the machine is about 6 feet tall by 8 feet wide, and you have to be in a queue, and you put your DNA in there, and it runs the system, and then it pops out with whether or not you have whatever it is, COVID-19 or whatever. before COVID-19, there was no need for this product, no need for the personal PCR. Why would you it just takes 2 days to get a test for XYZ flu or whatever, hepatitis, whatever it is you've got. It doesn't have to happen right now, but it was COVID-19 that drove the need to make this device something you could use at home. And that timing is everything, right? So that company's going to do really well because of timing. Yes, they have a good product. Yes, they have a good idea, but really it's timing that drives a lot of the. And by the way, even with Steve Jobs, if you look at personal computers, or you look at smartphones, or you look at iPods, iPads, any of these things, they didn't come from Apple first. They were, somebody else came up with them before, and it wasn't quite the right time, or they didn't have quite the product market fit or quite the right messaging.
Right.
And so a lot of it is timing. So when you're thinking about marketing something, you got to think about the what's going on around you that you don't have any control over, that you can fit into. And that's where positioning plays, right? That's where you have to like twist things a little bit so that they fit into the time that you're in.
Being able to understand the context that you're putting your product in the market is all about timing.
All about timing. Yep.
Yeah. And so here's Alvy Ray spoke for us last fall, and did a bit of a chat. And he has this great story about Steve and his ability to work with teams, or not work with teams.
Or not.
Right. But one of his comments was that he and Steve were in this meeting, and he was in Steve's office, and he went up to use the whiteboard and write something. He was trying to show him why the Jeffrey Moore curve was being a factor in the technology being where you need to have it so that you were creating better product. And therefore the timing, he couldn't do Toy Story 2 when Steve wanted to do it. So he was drawing on the board, trying to explain this to him. And Steve goes, stop. And Alvy goes, okay, maybe he's not understanding Jeffrey Moore. And he goes, you can't do that. And he goes, well, no, the technology. He goes, I'm not talking about the technology. You can't write on my whiteboard. Sit down.
Oh, that's so funny.
This other side that, he was very concerned about containing and controlling, but he was replicating. In other words, but people always thought he came up with the idea because he spoke like that.
Right. But he didn't come up with most of these ideas. He didn't come up with.
Right.
He just saw how to optimize them, right? How to turn them into something that the market would want. I mean, other than reinventing the way music was done, which he absolutely did do, I think with a lot of help. Mm-hmm. None of these ideas were originally his.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was also going to comment, you, with your music background, I always liked it when I was hiring software people, if they had a music background, they were my first candidates, because somehow they got what the whole issue of software, because you have to place the notes on the grid in the same way you had to place the coding on the cards at that time, because that's not real.
And it's an image-based language that is just like programming is. I agree. So many software people are great musicians. In fact, many of these companies that we see every day have bands built, of their software engineers who are incredible. They're just really quite talented.
Right.
So,
okay. Here's another one. What would you suggest to entrepreneurs who are second movers in the technology area?
So the first thing I'll say to you, if you're a second mover, you have a way better chance of succeeding than if you're the first mover. This first mover advantage thing, that does not hold true in technology. It may be true in other things, but it's not in technology because you're making so many mistakes. There's so many factors at play with a new technology that you just make a lot of mistakes, and it's usually the third or the fourth company who comes into a situation and has watched the mistakes made by the first movers. And they fix those things. And I've worked with so many companies that had brand new technologies that looked so promising, and they just couldn't get it to the point where it was commercial stuff.
Yeah, that's the story of Beta and VHS. Beta came out what I considered to be the best technology, but it had any marketing sense about it or knew what to do. VHS watched how people wanted to use it and captured the distribution system where Beta was still trying to sell the technology.
Yep, it's hard. It's hard being a first mover. In fact, I cannot actually think of anything that is the first mover that actually succeeded over time.
Yeah.
There might be some, but not many.
I agree with that. I really like the way when you come to the class and you talk about how branding and positioning are intertwined, like the yin yang kind of a thing.
Yeah.
And that they're not the same thing. Talk to me a little bit about that. Talk to the people a little bit about that.
Sure. So I have this underlying thesis that companies are like people because, they're made of people, they serve people, it's people who invent the products inside them. So there's a lot of people-ness going on inside of a company. So I look at a company's identity as like I would a person's, which there's two sides to it. There's a rational side and there's an emotional side. And if you're going to try to sell something to someone, you have to be able to fulfill both their rational and their emotional needs for whatever product it is that you're trying to push out there. And so I see the rational side as being the positioning side. That's the very clear, who are you and why do you matter? But then you also have to understand what is the emotion you're trying to elicit with this customer so that you can create that emotion, right? If you don't know what that emotion is, you can't create it. And emotions are triggered by language, tone of voice, color schemes, taglines. They're very much the sort of artsy side of the marketing equation. Whereas your rational side is very much triggered by are you filling my need? What is the problem that you're going to solve for me? So if you don't do both of those two things with a company, you're going to not be a full solution to what it is the problem that they have or the issue that they're trying to solve. So the most companies hire branding agencies to do what I call just the emotional side. So people will often say, I'm rebranding my company. Oh, what are you doing? We're changing the logo. We're changing the color scheme. We got a new tagline. Great. Well, that's not going to help you sell more stuff, right? It feels good at the moment. It's like a huge glitz rush, Mm-hmm. But then after a few days, it's like, okay, well, what's really changed here? How are we're still positioned the same way. We still have the same messaging. You got to do that stuff first and then do the sexy stuff. The sexy stuff is fun, but it's got to come second.
Right. On sustainability, what do you think it'll take to be a big mover and have real impact, not just greenwash something, but really in this sustainability craze that we're in now? What do you think it's going to take to be a big mover?
Well, I think it's going to take technology. The great thing about that movement is that it has gone mainstream now. So people now want sustainability. They'll pay for it. It's kind of gotten to a point where it's not just an idea anymore. So if you're a company that's just trying to greenwash your product or whatever to say that it's sustainable and it isn't, that's going to be found out right away, and you won't be sustainable. So I love the fact that it's part of the gestalt now of our society, but it does take technology. If anybody's ever gone to visit the Recology Center on Highway 101, which is a trash management, thing, you would be amazed at the technology that goes into just dealing with your garbage, right? It's amazing. And so the more technology that we have that can intelligently separate things, put things in the right places, catalog them, identify them, all of that, that's what technology does. And the artificial intelligence that I spoke about earlier is making this faster, more intelligent, easier all the time. So I think in order to really be a sustainable society, we have to have the cultural desire to be it, and I think we're almost there. Mm-hmm. And then we have to have the technology to realize it.
Yeah. One of our students, Shreya, Sarika, is doing something called Refibered, where she noticed 70% of what goes into the trash is fabric of one sort or another, be it carpets, be it towels, be it clothes, Levi's, whatever. And she's taking that fabric and repurposing it. And what she's doing is taking out the metal and using AI and mechanical engineering to sift and sort and get rid of that. Then they're taking the dye and the stains and the processing thing out of the fabric. And then from that, they dissolve and then create a new thread. And
Wow.
when she gets through with all of that, she's going to have an impact of like 30% on what's getting thrown away as opposed to now 70%.
That is so
And
cool. And that's technology, right? That's
it is.
enabling her.
And it's all three kinds of engineering that is going on there:
Yep.
mechanical, chemical, and the computer systems with AI, and how to apply that in terms of making the product.
That's
Now, what
very
they're working on,
inspirational.
though, what they're working on is what you're giving us is how do you brand and position and put that in the marketplace in where it can have that big impact and make a big sustainable difference.
Yeah. Well, that sounds like a solution to a big problem. So that's a great thing.
Well, I tell
Start with that.
No, don't walk in and tell me you're just going to do another parking app. I don't do parking apps.
Yeah, we have a lot of those. That's the other thing about technology. Things seem to get developed in clusters, right?
Right.
It's parking apps, or it's ride sharing apps, or it's hotel apps. So
Right.
so yeah, it is funny. People kind of cluster around ideas at a given time, but solving a real problem, that's what
thing.
technology is really good for. And finding a parking place, it's kind of a problem, but it's not that big of a problem.
Well, I'm going to turn this back over to Lauren because I'm watching the clock here, and you need to be 3:30 on. So, but I thank you very, very much for taking the time to share the journey as well as the fun thoughts. And just out of curiosity, do you still have that Corvette?
No, I don't. But you know what? I think that Corvette is here in Sausalito. I go running. I go running every day past this Corvette parked somewhere. It looks exactly like my Corvette. There's no way for me to really tell that, but it sure looks exactly like mine.
Yeah.
No, I should have kept it though.
My first car after I got a really good job when I went to work doing the systems world, I got a Porsche, and boy, that was my love of my life car. Yeah. And everywhere I went, I lived in that car.
Yeah, and I lived in my car too. Yeah, it's amazing. But you know what? Now I'm old and I don't care about cars anymore.
Thank you.
In fact, I'm looking out the window at a 1940s car right now. It's like,
oh my goodness.
Yeah, amazing.
Well, I'll look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks in April.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it too. I hear you're going back to school in person.
Back in
like
public
tomorrow.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Yep. Right.
That's great.
Doing cool stuff.
Great.
But thank you. Everybody says thank you, Andy.
Thank you, everybody. It was very nice of you to spend your time with me.
Cars are the DNA here's one. I love this. Cars are the DNA of California girls. That's my Gladys say.
That they are.
Andy, we have this tradition of ending the call with our distinguished speakers and asking you for kind of parting words of wisdom to share with the students before we sign off. So what advice do you have for the students who are on the call, who are at the very beginnings of their careers, like you were when we started this conversation today?
Wow. Well, you know what I think I would say is take the risk. There's no better time in your life to take risks than now. And starting a company, building a new product, building a new technology, coming up with a new way to recycle things, like there's no better time to take a risk than this point in your career. It only gets harder as you get older. So do it.